6:00 in the morning. Detroit, 1973. November, cold settles over the Fisher Body Fleetwood plant on Fort Street. Inside the 40-acre complex, the heat from welding torches and paint ovens pushes the temperature past 85 degrees. The night shift is finishing up, and the bodies in white bare metal shells that will become Cadillac Fleetwoods, Eldorados, and Sevilles move through stations with mechanical precision. This is where luxury is manufactured, not in small workshops by craftsmen wearing white coats, not in European ateliers with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Here, in this sprawling industrial fortress, 12,000 workers build the bodies for America's most prestigious automobiles. Cadillac's flagship vehicles, the cars that presidents and movie stars and business tycoons drive, all start here as sheets of steel transformed by workers who know how to make metal bend and yield and become something beautiful. The Fisher Body name means something in 1973. Body by Fisher. The badge appears on tens of millions of General Motors vehicles. It's a promise of quality, a symbol that the 7 Fisher brothers from Ohio built into one of the most successful manufacturing operations in American history. But already, the cracks are showing. Japanese competition, fuel crisis, changing consumer preferences. The American automobile industry is entering a crisis that will transform everything. And Fisher Body, the crown jewel of GM's manufacturing empire, will be one of the casualties. By 1987, Fisher Body as an independent division will cease to exist, absorbed into other GM operations. By 2000, the Fort Street plant will be closed, demolished, erased as if 70 years of production never happened. By 2024, the 40 acres where 12,000 workers once built America's finest automobile bodies will be mostly empty lots, with a few remaining structures that nobody remembers. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of America's industrial giants and the massive factories they abandoned, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which forgotten manufacturing complex I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Let's begin. The Fisher Body story begins not in Detroit, but in Norwalk, Ohio, a small town where Lawrence Peter Fisher ran a carriage shop in the 1880s. He and his wife Margaret raised 11 children. 7 of them were boys who would change the American automobile industry forever. Frederick, Charles, William, Lawrence, Edward, Alfred, and Howard Fisher grew up surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and varnish, learning to build horse-drawn carriages and wagons. Their father taught them that quality couldn't be rushed, that every joint had to be tight, every finish perfect, every component built to last. These weren't abstract principles. In the 1880s, a poorly built carriage could kill you. A wheel that failed on a steep hill, an axle that cracked on rough roads. These weren't inconveniences. They were tragedies. The Fisher boys learned to build things that wouldn't fail. By the early 1900s, the oldest brothers understood that the carriage business was dying. Those strange horseless carriages sputtering through American streets weren't toys or curiosities. They were the future. In 1902, Frederick Fisher, the eldest, moved to Detroit. He found work at the C.R. Wilson Company, a carriage manufacturer transitioning to automobile bodies. Charles joined him the following year. The brothers spent years learning every aspect of automobile body construction, from initial design to final finishing. In 1908, they made their move. On July 22nd, with $50,000 in capital, including $30,000 from their uncle Albert, Frederick and Charles established the Fisher Body Company. The timing was perfect. The automobile industry was exploding. Henry Ford's Model T was about to revolutionize transportation. But Ford and other manufacturers faced a problem. Building bodies was different from building engines and chassis. It required different skills, different facilities, different expertise. The Fisher brothers offered a solution. Let us build the bodies while you focus on mechanical components. The partnership model worked brilliantly. Fisher Body specialized in what customers saw, touched, and sat in. The automobile manufacturers focused on what made the cars run. One by one, the remaining Fisher brothers joined the company. William handled manufacturing. Lawrence managed sales. Edward, Alfred, and eventually Howard all found roles in the growing enterprise. The Fisher brothers operated with remarkable unity. A General Motors president would later observe that when one Fisher brother cut himself shaving, they all bled. By 1910, Fisher Body supplied closed bodies for Cadillac, Buick, Oakland, and Oldsmobile. The company wasn't just building car bodies. It was becoming the supplier every automaker needed. William Durant was building General Motors into an empire. He'd already acquired Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and Oakland. But Durant understood that controlling the supply chain was as important as owning the brands. In 1919, Durant made the Fisher brothers an offer. GM would purchase 60% of Fisher Body Corporation for approximately $200 million. The brothers would receive a fortune and remain in operational control. For 7 sons of an Ohio carriage maker, it was generational wealth beyond anything they'd imagined. But the deal made strategic sense for both parties. GM secured access to the best body supplier in the industry. Fisher Body gained the capital to expand dramatically and the stability of GM's backing. The brothers would continue running operations while GM integrated Fisher Body into its larger manufacturing network. In 1926, General Motors acquired the remaining Fisher Body shares, making it a wholly owned division. But even as part of GM, the Fisher brothers maintained their standards and their influence. The Body by Fisher badge, introduced in 1923, became one of the most recognized symbols in American manufacturing. For decades, hundreds of millions of GM vehicles would display that emblem on their doorsill plates. It represented quality. It represented craftsmanship. It represented the Fisher brothers' commitment to building automobile bodies better than anyone else. The brothers built monuments to their success. The Fisher Building on West Grand Boulevard, a 28-story Art Deco masterpiece designed by Albert Kahn, became one of Detroit's most beautiful structures. Its golden tower dominated the skyline. The building was so magnificent that it's still considered one of the world's most beautiful office buildings, rivaling the Chrysler Building in New York. As Fisher Body grew within General Motors, the company needed specialized facilities for different manufacturing operations. The Fleetwood plant on Fort Street was established to handle the highest-end production, the bodies for Cadillac's flagship vehicles. The complex eventually sprawled across 40 acres in southwest Detroit, a massive facility that would employ up to 12,000 workers at peak production. The scale was staggering. Multiple buildings connected by rail lines and overhead conveyors. The stamping operations where massive presses shaped sheet steel into fenders, doors, hoods, and roof panels. The welding halls where bodies in white came together. Hundreds of spot welds joining the panels into rigid structures. The paint facilities with their complex ventilation systems and multiple spray booths. The trim departments where interior components were installed. Everything integrated for maximum efficiency. The Fort Street plant wasn't building ordinary automobile bodies. These were Cadillac Fleetwoods, among the largest, most luxurious vehicles GM produced. The bodies required special attention, additional reinforcement, more complex assembly sequences. Where a Chevrolet body might take a few hours to complete, a Fleetwood body could take days. The workers at Fort Street were among the most skilled in the GM empire, the metal finishers who could shape panels by hand, removing every imperfection until the surface was mirror smooth. The welders who could lay beads so clean they required minimal grinding. The painters who applied multiple coats, color sanding between layers to achieve the deep, lustrous finishes that luxury car buyers demanded. These weren't just factory workers. They were craftsmen who happened to work in a factory. The neighborhoods around the plant thrived. Southwest Detroit became heavily Mexican and Middle Eastern, immigrant communities drawn by the good wages Fisher Body offered. Workers bought modest homes within walking distance of the factory. Their children attended Detroit public schools that were well-funded and well-regarded. Small businesses flourished along Verner Highway and other commercial corridors. Churches and mosques served diverse congregations united by their dependence on Fisher Body wages. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the Fort Street plant operated at a scale that seems almost incomprehensible today. At peak employment, more than 12,000 workers moved through the factory in 3 shifts that never stopped. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was for maintenance, the only time the lines went silent. The production numbers were extraordinary. In a good year, the Fort Street plant could produce bodies for more than 200,000 Cadillacs. That's nearly 4,000 bodies per week, more than 500 per shift. The bodies moved through the facility with mechanical precision, each station adding components until a complete body emerged ready for final assembly at Cadillac's plant a few miles away. The wages reflected the skill and the importance of the work. A skilled tradesman at Fisher Body in 1965 earned about $4.50 per hour, roughly $38,000 per year in today's money. That was enough to support a family of 4, own a home, own a car, take vacations, and save for retirement. Benefits were generous. The UAW had negotiated contracts that provided full health insurance, pensions that actually paid out, cost of living adjustments that protected against inflation. A worker who spent 30 years at Fisher Body could retire at 58, with a pension that would sustain him for the rest of his life. This was the American dream made real. Show up, work hard, master your craft, and in return receive wages that made middle-class life possible. Fisher Body delivered that promise to tens of thousands of workers across dozens of plants. The Body by Fisher badge meant something beyond quality. It meant good jobs. It meant communities built on manufacturing wages. It meant the belief that American industry could provide prosperity for workers as well as owners. The 1970s brought the first serious warnings that the system was breaking down. The oil embargo of 1973 devastated American automakers. When gasoline prices spiked and lines formed at gas stations, consumers suddenly wanted small, fuel-efficient vehicles. GM built large cars with V8 engines that consumed gasoline like it was free. Japanese manufacturers offered compact cars that delivered twice the fuel economy. Market share shifted dramatically. GM's dominance, which had peaked at nearly 60% of the U.S. market in the 1960s, began eroding. Toyota, Honda, and Datsun captured increasing percentages each year. Every lost sale was a lost body for Fisher Body to manufacture. The quality gap became impossible to ignore. Japanese automobiles were simply better built than American ones. Panels fit together precisely. Doors closed with solid sounds. Paint didn't peel. Bodies didn't rust through after 3 winters. American manufacturers, comfortable in their decades of dominance, had let quality slip. Fisher Body, despite its reputation, was part of the problem. The bodies the Fort Street plant produced were adequate but no longer exceptional. The tight tolerances and careful assembly that had defined Fisher Body in the 1930s and 1940s had given way to good enough manufacturing that met specifications but didn't exceed them. GM's response was automation and cost-cutting. The company invested billions in robots and computerized systems designed to improve quality while reducing labor costs. At Fort Street, robots began replacing welders. Automated paint systems replaced hand-painting operations. Each technological advancement eliminated jobs. Employment at the plant declined steadily through the 1970s and 1980s. The 12,000 workers of the peak years fell to 10,000, then 8,000, then 6,000. Each round of layoffs hit the surrounding neighborhoods like a hammer blow. In 1984, General Motors made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 2 decades earlier. The company would reorganize its manufacturing operations, eliminating Fisher Body as a separate division. Fisher Body's plants would be distributed among other GM divisions. Some would become part of the Chevrolet Pontiac Canada group. Others would join the Buick Oldsmobile Cadillac group. The Fisher Body name would remain on vehicles for another decade. But the division that the 7 brothers had built was effectively dissolved. The reorganization was presented as efficiency and rationalization. GM was too complex, with too many divisions and too much bureaucracy. Consolidating operations would reduce costs and improve coordination. But the real reason was that Fisher Body's independence had become inconvenient. GM wanted complete vertical integration, with body manufacturing under the same management as final assembly. Fisher Body, as a separate entity, even a wholly owned one, created coordination problems and duplicated administrative functions. For the workers, the reorganization changed little immediately. They still built automobile bodies in the same plants. Their paychecks still came from GM, but psychologically, something had shifted. The Body by Fisher identity. The pride in being part of a legendary manufacturing operation was being erased. They were just GM workers now, building parts for GM vehicles. By 1987, Fisher Body as a division ceased to exist entirely. The plants continued operating under different organizational structures, but the name that had meant something for 79 years was, through the 1990s, the Fort Street plant continued shrinking. Employment fell below 5,000, then below 3,000. Sections of the factory closed as production consolidated into fewer areas. The neighborhood around the plant deteriorated as workers were laid off or retired without replacement. By the late 1990s, GM was facing new pressures. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing billions on operations that couldn't compete with lean, efficient foreign manufacturers. The solution was more closures, more consolidation, more elimination of excess capacity. The Fort Street plant was an obvious target. The facility was old, built in an era when multi-building complexes made sense. Modern body manufacturing happened in single-story facilities with efficient layouts. Fort Street, with its 40 acres spread across multiple structures, couldn't compete. In 1999, General Motors announced that the Fort Street plant would close. The 2,500 remaining workers would be laid off or transferred. Production would move to newer facilities. The buildings would be sold or demolished. The last body rolled off the Fort Street assembly line in early 2000. Workers who'd spent their entire careers at the plant watched it close, knowing that what they'd built there, the skills they'd developed, the pride they'd taken in their work, meant nothing to GM's bottom line. Some workers found positions at other GM plants. Many didn't. The older workers took early retirement, accepting reduced pensions. The younger workers, with less seniority, faced unemployment in a city where good manufacturing jobs had become scarce. GM sold the Fort Street property for demolition. The buildings came down in the early 2000s, torn apart by excavators and wrecking crews. The 40 acres that had produced bodies for millions of Cadillacs were cleared, leaving mostly empty land. A few structures survived, converted to warehouse or light industrial use. But the massive complex that had employed 12,000 workers at peak was gone, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The demolition was efficient and unremarkable, unlike the Packard plant, which stood as ruins for decades, or Dodge, Maine, which became a symbol of industrial loss. The Fort Street Fisher body plant simply disappeared. No photographers documented its decay. No urban explorers made it famous. It closed, was demolished, and vanished from public consciousness. Today, if you drive past the site on Fort Street, you'll see empty lots and a few industrial buildings that bear no resemblance to the original complex. Someone unfamiliar with Detroit's history would have no idea that one of the most important body manufacturing facilities in American automotive history once stood there. The neighborhood around the former plant never recovered. Southwest Detroit remains one of the city's poorest areas, with poverty rates far exceeding the city average. The houses that Fisher body workers bought in the 1950s and 1960s have aged without adequate maintenance. Many are abandoned. Crime remains high. The schools struggle with limited resources and declining enrollment. The social infrastructure built around Fisher body wages collapsed and was never replaced. The good jobs that allowed high school graduates to support families and retire with dignity are gone. What replaced them are service jobs paying a fraction of what Fisher body offered, with minimal benefits and no pensions. The closure of the Fort Street plant destroyed more than 2,500 jobs. It destroyed an entire way of understanding work and its relationship to life. The workers who built Fisher bodies believed in certain principles that seemed self-evident. If you worked hard and mastered your craft, you'd be rewarded with good wages. If you were loyal to your employer, that loyalty would be reciprocated. If you built quality products, job security would follow. Fisher body's closure and dissolution taught them those principles were false. GM felt no loyalty to workers who'd given the company decades of service. Quality didn't matter if the market wanted cheaper vehicles. Hard work wasn't enough when automation could do the job for less. The psychological impact was profound. These weren't people who'd failed. They'd done everything society asked. They'd learned difficult skills. They'd shown up every day. They'd built products they could take pride in. And none of it mattered when GM's accountants decided the Fort Street plant was too expensive to operate. Many workers never trusted corporations again. They'd learned that loyalty flows one direction, that workers owe companies everything while companies owe workers nothing beyond what contracts legally require. The skills the workers possessed died with them. The knowledge of how to hand-finish metal, how to achieve perfect panel gaps, how to create the fit and finish that luxury automobiles required, that expertise was never transferred to a new generation. When those workers retired or died, the knowledge disappeared. Nobody builds automobile bodies the way Fisher body did in its prime. Nobody can. The economics don't work. The market doesn't support it. Modern automobile manufacturing is about efficiency and automation, not craftsmanship. What was lost isn't just jobs or even skills. It's an entire philosophy of manufacturing that believed quality and careful work mattered more than speed and cost minimization. The 7 Fisher brothers died between 1944 and 1972. None of them lived to see Fisher body dissolved as a division in 1987. None saw the Fort Street plant closed and demolished. None witnessed the Body by Fisher badge disappear from GM vehicles. By 1995, GM stopped using the emblem that had appeared on hundreds of millions of vehicles. The badge that represented the Fisher brothers' commitment to quality became an artifact, a piece of automotive history that younger generations didn't recognize. The Fisher Building still stands on West Grand Boulevard, one of Detroit's most beautiful structures. But it's an office building now, with no connection to automobile manufacturing. The Fisher name survives in Detroit as a landmark, but disconnected from the industrial empire that created it. The brothers' descendants remain wealthy, though none are involved in automobile manufacturing. The fortune that 7 boys from Ohio built through skill and determination persists through investments and trusts. But the company they built, the Body by Fisher identity they created, is gone. Historians and automotive enthusiasts remember Fisher Body for its contributions to American manufacturing. The company pioneered technologies and techniques that became industry standards. The closed bodies, the all-steel construction, the quality control processes. Fisher Body innovated continuously for decades, but outside specialized circles, Fisher Body is largely forgotten. Most Americans under 50 have never heard of it. They don't know that the bodies of virtually every GM vehicle built between 1920 and 1980 were manufactured by Fisher Body plants. They don't know about the 7 brothers or the empire they built, or the tens of thousands of workers who built their careers on Fisher Body wages. Fisher Body's decline was part of a larger catastrophe. Detroit lost more than half its population between 1950 and 2020, falling from 1.85 million to barely 640,000. The city that had been America's 4th largest became a symbol of urban decay. The automobile industry didn't disappear from Detroit entirely. GM, Ford, and Stellantis still maintain significant operations in and around the city. But employment is a fraction of what it was in the peak years, where hundreds of thousands once worked in automobile plants. Now tens of thousands remain. The jobs that do exist are fundamentally different. Modern automobile manufacturing is heavily automated. The factories employ engineers and technicians rather than the skilled tradesmen who built Fisher Bodies. A contemporary automobile plant might employ 3,000 workers, where a 1960s plant employed 15,000. The neighborhoods that grew up around plants like Fort Street never recovered. Southwest Detroit, the area around the old Fisher Body plant, remains deeply troubled. The houses built for auto workers in the 1920s and 1930s have aged into obsolescence. Many are abandoned. Crime and poverty define daily life. The city government, bankrupt in 2013 and only emerging from state oversight in recent years, lacks resources to provide adequate services. Police response times are slow. Schools are underfunded. Infrastructure crumbles. Downtown Detroit has seen genuine renewal in the past decade. Young professionals have moved into renovated buildings. Restaurants and shops have opened, but this revival hasn't reached neighborhoods like Southwest Detroit, where the Fisher Body plant once provided economic stability. The gap between Detroit's renewed downtown and its struggling neighborhoods keeps widening. The prosperity, such as it is, belongs to a different class of people working different kinds of jobs, while the communities built on manufacturing wages continue their slow decline. Could Fisher Body have survived as an independent division? The question is almost absurd given that GM owned the company completely and could dissolve it at will. Fisher Body didn't fail in any traditional sense. The plants continued producing bodies. The workers were skilled. The products were adequate. Fisher Body disappeared because GM decided that having a separate body division was organizationally inefficient. But that raises harder questions about corporate loyalty and the value of legacy. Did GM have any obligation to preserve the Fisher Body identity? To honor the contribution that the 7 brothers and their workers had made to GM's success? The answer, based on what happened, was clearly no. GM felt no such obligation. When organizational efficiency demanded eliminating Fisher Body as a division, GM did so without hesitation. The workers and the history were just costs to be managed. Could the Fort Street plant have been saved with more investment? Perhaps. But GM was already operating dozens of body plants. The company didn't need the capacity. Investing millions to modernize Fort Street made no sense when newer, more efficient facilities existed elsewhere. The broader question is whether American manufacturing could have maintained the employment and wages that built the middle class. The answer is complicated. Automation eliminates jobs regardless of management decisions. Foreign competition forces cost reductions that often mean moving production to lower-wage countries. The forces that destroyed Fisher Body and plants like it were larger than any single company or industry. But acknowledging those forces doesn't absolve GM or other corporations of responsibility for how they managed the transition. The workers who lost their jobs at Fort Street weren't given adequate retraining or support. The communities that collapsed when plants closed received minimal assistance. The social cost of deindustrialization was treated as an externality, something unfortunate but not the corporation's problem. The Fisher Body Fort Street plant operated for roughly 70 years, from the 1920s until 2000. At peak employment, 12,000 workers built bodies for Cadillac's finest automobiles. The facility sprawled across 40 acres, one of the largest body manufacturing operations in American automotive history. Today, the site is mostly empty lots. A few buildings remain, used for warehousing or light industrial purposes that have nothing to do with automobile manufacturing. Someone driving past on Fort Street would never know that one of the crown jewels of American manufacturing once stood there. The Fisher brothers built an empire on the principle that quality mattered, that careful craftsmanship could be applied to mass production, that automobile bodies should be built as well as the finest furniture. For decades, Body by Fisher meant something. It meant standards maintained. It meant pride in work. It meant thousands of workers building products they could point to with satisfaction. That empire is gone. Fisher Body as a division was dissolved in 1987. The badge disappeared from GM vehicles in 1995. The Fort Street plant closed in 2000. The 40 acres that once hummed with industrial activity are silent. The workers who built Fisher Bodies are dead or scattered. The youngest would be in their 50s now. The older ones are gone. The skills they possessed, the knowledge refined through years of practice, died with them. Nobody trains workers to build automobile bodies the way Fisher Body did in its prime. Nobody can. The economics don't justify it. The market doesn't demand it. Modern manufacturing is about efficiency and automation, not the careful craftsmanship that defined Fisher Body. The neighborhoods around the Fort Street plant remain troubled. Southwest Detroit struggles with poverty and crime that grew worse after the plant closed. The houses that auto workers bought are abandoned or poorly maintained. The schools are underfunded. The social infrastructure that Fisher Body wages supported collapsed and was never replaced. The Fisher Building still stands downtown, a beautiful Art Deco monument to the brothers' success. But it's disconnected from the industrial empire that built it. The building is offices and shops serving a Detroit that has moved beyond manufacturing. The question that haunts the empty lots where the Fort Street plant stood is the question that haunts all of Detroit's abandoned factories. What was lost when American manufacturing collapsed? Not just jobs, though tens of thousands of those disappeared. Not just production capacity, though millions of automobile bodies went unbuilt. What was lost was the belief that hard work would be rewarded, that loyalty would be reciprocated, that building things with your hands meant something permanent. The workers at Fisher Body Fort Street believed those things. They showed up every day and welded and painted and assembled automobile bodies, believing that their work mattered, that their skills were valuable, that their employer would honor their contribution. GM dissolved Fisher Body without hesitation when organizational efficiency demanded it. The company closed the Fort Street plant without sentiment when the numbers said it was too expensive. The workers who'd given their careers to Fisher Body were laid off or forced into early retirement. Their decades of service worth only what their union contracts legally required. No loyalty, no recognition, no acknowledgement that they'd helped build GM into the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. Just pink slips and closed gates and empty lots where a factory once stood. The Fisher brothers created something remarkable. 7 boys from Ohio built an empire on quality and craftsmanship. They proved that automobile bodies could be manufactured at scale without sacrificing standards. They employed tens of thousands of workers and built communities and created a legacy that seemed permanent. It wasn't permanent. It lasted less than a century. The division was dissolved. The plants were closed. The workers were discarded. The 40-acre Fort Street complex was demolished and erased. What remains are empty lots and fading memories and the question nobody can answer. If we can destroy something this important, this completely, what exactly is permanent? The Fisher Body Fort Street plant built bodies for millions of Cadillacs. It employed 12,000 workers at peak. It operated for 7 decades. And now it's gone, forgotten by everyone except the workers who built their lives around it, and the neighborhood that never recovered from its closure. That's the dark story of Fisher Body. Not the success of 7 brothers who built an empire. Not the millions of automobile bodies produced to exacting standards. Not the Body by Fisher badge that appeared on hundreds of millions of vehicles. The dark story is how completely it all disappeared, how thoroughly it was forgotten, how little any of it mattered when GM decided the past was less important than efficiency. 70 years of production, 12,000 jobs at peak, 40 acres of industrial might, all of it erased, leaving nothing but empty lots and questions nobody wants to answer about what we lost when American manufacturing died.